Alright everyone, settle in for tonight's exploration. We're veering off the well-trodden path of heroic sagas, and stepping into something a touch more unvarnished. Prepare for a deep dive, not into celebrated triumphs, but into the forgotten toil and the everyday grit of life, in the harsh, unforgiving settlements of Viking Greenland. That glossy version of history you've seen in movies, of fearless explorers easily conquering new lands. Well, the unvarnished truth of their existence on that icy fringe of the known world was often a far cry, and frankly your modern comforts would feel like a distant, unimaginable dream. So, find your coziest spot. If you appreciate a journey into the raw, unfiltered past, a like on the video would be fantastic, and do consider subscribing for more of these historical reality checks. As always, I'm curious to know where you're joining us from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and time. It's always a highlight seeing our global community. Okay, perhaps dim those lights, let a soft ambient sound fill the room, and let's embark on tonight's rather sobering journey together, into the heart of Viking Greenland's chilling reality. You picture Vikings, and perhaps your mind conjures images of long ships slicing through icy waters, fierce warriors clad in mail, axes glinting. Eric the Red, a figure larger than life, banished from Iceland, seeking new horizons. He found Greenland, a vast, white expanse, and with a touch of what we might now call shrewd marketing, named it something appealing to draw settlers. But Greenland was a promise whispered against a backdrop of stark frozen reality. The journey itself, from Iceland or Norway, was a brutal filter. Crammed into open boats, tossed by the North Atlantic's fury, you'd endure weeks of bone-chilling cold, relentless dampness, and the constant gnawing fear of foundering. Seasickness would be your unwelcome companion, the taste of salt and despair a constant on your tongue. Many voyages likely ended unseen, unheard, swallowed by the unforgiving sea, long before any Greenland, however illusory, came into view. Imagine, after such an ordeal, finally sighting land. Not the lush pastures the name might imply, but towering ice-scoured cliffs, fjords choked with glacial ice, and a wind that seemed to cut through to your very marrow. The areas deemed habitable, the so-called eastern and western settlements, were narrow strips of coastal land, marginally less hostile than the colossal ice sheet that dominated the island's interior. Your first task, even before proper shelter, would be to scout for the barest necessities: fresh water not yet frozen, any scrap of driftwood for a meager fire, and perhaps a sheltered inlet to beach your exhausted vessel. The air itself would feel different, thin and sharp, carrying the scent of ice, salt water, and an unnerving profound silence, broken only by the cries of seabirds or the distant groan of a glacier. This was not a land of easy bounty. Building a home here was an exercise in relentless toil and resourcefulness, or rather coping with the lack of resources. Forget grand wooden halls, timber was incredibly scarce. Most of what little wood existed was stunted birch and willow, laboriously harvested. Your dwelling would more likely be a longhouse, yes, but constructed primarily from turf and stone. Imagine cutting and hauling heavy blocks of sod, your hands raw and frozen, stacking them meticulously to form thick, insulating walls. The roof too would be turf over a meager wooden frame, constantly damp, prone to leaks, and occasionally, one imagines, home to various small, unwelcome creatures. Inside it would be dim, smoky from the central hearth, if you were lucky enough to have fuel, and crowded with family, livestock in winter, and the pervasive smell of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and preserved food. The romantic image of the Viking feast, laden with roasted meats, and overflowing tankards, clashes sharply with the Greenlandic reality. Arable farming was a near impossibility. The growing season was brutally short, the soil thin and poor. While they attempted to grow barley, yields were meager and unreliable, often failing entirely. Your diet would be a monotonous, desperate scramble for protein and fat. Seal hunting was paramount, the blubber for fuel and food, the meat a staple. You'd hunt walrus for ivory, a crucial trade good, and their tough hides. Caribou, if you could find them inland, were a prize. Seabirds and their eggs in the short summer offered a brief respite. Fish, surprisingly, seem not to have been as central to their diet, as one might expect, perhaps due to fishing technology or local conditions. Preserving food was not a matter of culinary art, but of stark survival. Without reliable salt production, you'd rely on methods like drying, smoking, if you had fuel, and fermentation. Imagine the smell of drying fish, or meat hanging in your already cramped and smoky longhouse. A constant, pungent aroma. Fermented foods, while providing necessary nutrients, could be an acquired taste, to put it mildly. The risk of spoilage was ever present, and a bad batch could mean sickness, or starvation. Winter, the long dark Greenlandic winter, was a period of profound anxiety. Would your stored supplies last? Would the livestock survive on meager fodder? Each day would be a small victory against the encroaching cold and hunger, the darkness pressing in not just from outside, but from within your own strained reserves. Consider the simple act of staying warm. In a land where trees were a precious rarity, fuel was a constant concern. Driftwood, when it could be found washed ashore, was a treasure. Otherwise you relied on dried animal dung and blubber from seals and whales. If the hunt was successful, these would produce a smoky, often acrid fire, filling your poorly ventilated longhouse with fumes that stung the eyes and coated everything with a greasy soot. Your clothing would be practical, not fashionable. Wool from your hardy sheep, spun and woven by the women, and animal skins, laboriously prepared and stitched, were your only defense against the biting winds and sub-zero temperatures. Layers were key, but even so, the cold would seep into your bones, a constant unwelcome companion, making every movement an effort. Health and hygiene, as we understand them, were luxuries far beyond reach. Water, often from melted snow, or ice, would be precious and likely not always clean. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. In such close, smoky and often damp living conditions, respiratory illnesses would have been rampant. A simple cut or injury, easily treatable today, could quickly become infected and life-threatening, without antibiotics or effective antiseptics. Dental health was appalling. Archaeological remains show teeth worn down to the gums from a gritty diet, and the use of teeth as tools. Imagine the chronic pain, the difficulty eating, the constant low-level suffering that was simply a part of everyday existence. Childbirth was perilous for both mother and infant, a terrifying gamble in an isolated outpost far from any sophisticated medical knowledge. Socially, life in the Greenland settlements was tight-knit, born of necessity, but also likely rife with underlying tension. You lived in small, isolated communities, often just a few farmsteads clustered together in a fjord. Everyone knew everyone else's business. While there was a hierarchy, with chieftains and wealthier farmers holding more sway, survival depended on cooperation. Yet, in a resource-scarce environment, disputes over land, livestock, or perceived slights could easily escalate. The sagas, while often romanticized, also hint at feuds and violence. Imagine the psychological pressure of living in such close proximity, with limited personal space, and the constant awareness of your dependence on others, even those you might not particularly like or trust. Privacy would be a forgotten concept. Trade was the lifeline, the tenuous connection back to Europe, primarily Norway and Iceland. Greenland had little to offer, except for exotic, high-value goods: walrus ivory, tusks and skulls, narwhal tusks, often passed off as unicorn horns, live polar bears or gar falcons for royalty, and hides. In return, they desperately needed iron for tools and weapons, timber for boat repair and construction, grain when their own meager harvests failed, and perhaps some luxury goods to remind them of a world left behind. But these voyages were infrequent, dangerous, and expensive. A ship might arrive once a year, or perhaps not at all if disaster struck or profits dwindled. Imagine the anticipation, the hope, and then the crushing disappointment if the trade ship failed to appear, leaving you to face another year with dwindling supply. Then came the creeping chill of the Little Ice Age, beginning in the 14th century. This wasn't a sudden cataclysm, but a gradual, relentless cooling of the climate. For a settlement already clinging to the very edge of survivability, the consequences were devastating. Growing seasons, already precariously short, shrank further. Sea ice, once a seasonal nuisance, began to choke the fjords for longer periods, making hunting more difficult and isolating communities. The routes for trade ships became more hazardous, perhaps discouraging voyages altogether. The delicate balance the Norse had struck with this harsh environment began to tilt inexorably against them. This wasn't a dramatic battle against a visible foe, but a slow, grinding attrition by an increasingly hostile climate. The indigenous people of Greenland, the Thule culture Inuit, whom the Norse called Skrellings, were a factor often overlooked in romanticized Viking tales. They were master hunters, perfectly adapted to the Arctic environment in a way the Norse, with their European farming traditions, were. Initial encounters might have been cautious, perhaps involving some trade, but as resources dwindled and the climate worsened, competition for hunting grounds and scarce resources like driftwood likely led to increased friction and conflict. Archaeological evidence and scant, textual mentions suggest a relationship that was far from harmonious, punctuated by raids and mistrust. The Norse, with their iron weapons, might have had an initial advantage, but the Inuit's superior Arctic survival skills and growing numbers likely posed a significant long-term challenge. Imagine the psychological toll of this the gnawing uncertainty, the ever-present threat of starvation or freezing, the isolation from the wider world. Superstition and a deep-seated belief in fate likely permeated their world. Bad omens, a failed hunt, an unexpected storm, all could be interpreted as signs of displeasure from a pantheon of Norse gods, or later, the Christian God, to whom they had converted, perhaps in hopes of divine intervention, that never fully materialized. The sagas are full of tales of ghosts, trolls and malevolent spirits, reflections of a people living on the edge, surrounded by a vast, indifferent, and often terrifying landscape. The darkness of the long winters would have amplified these fears, breeding a unique kind of mental resilience, or perhaps, a slow descent into despair. As the 14th and early 15th centuries progressed, the Greenland settlements began to fade. The western settlement, smaller and more northerly, appears to have been abandoned first, perhaps by the mid. The reasons are debated: a combination of climate change, failed adaptation, possible conflict with the Inuit, or perhaps a desperate migration to the eastern settlement, or even an attempt to return to Iceland or Norway. There are no dramatic accounts of its end, just a chilling silence in the historical record. Farmsteads were left, not in a state of sudden disaster, but as if people simply walked away, or gradually died out, too weak or too few to maintain their way of life. The image is one of slow, inexorable decline, not a heroic last stand. The eastern settlement, larger and slightly more southerly, clung on for longer, perhaps into the mid-15th century, but it too was struggling. Communication with Europe became increasingly sporadic. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, would have crippled trade networks, and perhaps reduced the number of ships and mariners willing or able to make the perilous journey to Greenland. The value of walrus ivory, their main export, also declined as elephant ivory from Africa became more readily available in European markets. The economic underpinnings of the colony were crumbling, just as the climate was making life itself ever more difficult. It was a slow squeeze from multiple directions. Archaeological evidence from the later periods of settlement paints a grim picture. Analysis of human remains shows signs of severe malnutrition, a population struggling with rickets and other deficiency diseases. They were quite literally starving. There's evidence they were eating more and more of their domestic animals, down to the very bones, and relying increasingly on marine resources, even those previously considered low status. The average height of individuals decreased, a common indicator of prolonged nutritional stress. These were not mighty Vikings feasting in mead halls, but a desperate people slowly succumbing to an environment that had finally become too hostile to endure, their traditional ways of life failing them. One of the most poignant pieces of evidence comes from Herjolfsnes, a farm in the eastern settlement, where European-style clothing from the 14th and 15th centuries was remarkably preserved in the permafrost. While showing an attempt to keep up with European fashions, the garments also reveal a desperate thriftiness, patches upon patches, clothes mended and remended, turned and returned until they were threadbare. It speaks of a people clinging to their cultural identity, to their European roots, even as their physical world was collapsing around them. It's a silent testament to their pride and their poverty, a heartbreaking glimpse into their final decade. The last written record, mentioning the Greenlanders, comes from a papal letter dated 1448, though it refers to events some years prior, describing a raid on the colony by pagans, likely Inuit, who had destroyed churches and carried off inhabitants. However, many scholars believe the colony was already in its death throes by then, and this was perhaps a final, isolated incident rather than the sole cause of demise. Another account, from an Icelandic annal in 1410, records a wedding at Valsey Church, one of the best preserved Norse ruins in Greenland. After that, the curtain of silence descends. For centuries, what happened to the Greenland Vikings was a mystery, a footnote in history. Why didn't they adapt more like the Inuit? This is a question often asked. They did adapt, to a degree, their housing, their reliance on seal, but they remained fundamentally European in their agricultural mindset, their social structure, and their material culture, which depended on iron and other imported goods. Perhaps their cultural conservatism, their unwillingness or inability to fully embrace Inuit survival strategies, like sophisticated kayak hunting or different clothing styles, ultimately sealed their fate. Or perhaps the Inuit, who were expanding southwards, simply outcompeted them for scarce resources, or actively pushed them out. The truth is likely a complex interplay of all these factors. There's no evidence of a single, cataclysmic event that wiped them out. No mass graves suggesting a great plague or a final, lost battle. Instead, the picture is one of a slow, agonizing dwindle. Imagine the last few families, isolated on their farmsteads, watching their neighbors' fires go out one by one, the church bells falling silent, the knowledge that no more ships would come,
the growing realization that they were alone, forgotten, at the very edge of the world, with no escape. The despair must have been profound, a silence more terrifying than any storm. Did they try to sail away, only to be lost at sea? Did they succumb to starvation and disease, one by one, or did some, in a final act of desperation or adaptation, assimilate into Inuit society, leaving no Norse trace behind? The rediscovery of the settlements in the 18th century by Danish colonizers found only ruins, collapsed longhouses, overgrown fields, and the poignant remains of churches. The sagas spoke of a thriving colony, but the reality on the ground was one of abandonment and decay. It was a stark reminder that even the most resilient people can be overcome by environmental change and isolation. The Greenland Vikings were not a failure in the sense of lacking courage or skill. They survived for nearly 500 years in one of the most challenging environments ever colonized by Europeans. But their story is a sobering testament to the limits of human endurance and the unforgiving nature of a world indifferent to human ambition. Think about the layers of clothing you might wear on a chilly day. Now imagine that being your permanent state, but with garments far less effective, often damp and smelling of wood smoke, animal fat, and unwashed bodies. The constant, itching discomfort of coarse wool against your skin, the struggle to keep your feet dry in inadequate leather, the chilblains on your fingers and toes, a painful reminder of the ever-present cold. These small persistent miseries, often unrecorded in grand historical narratives, formed the daily texture of life. It wasn't just about surviving the big threats. It was about enduring the 1,000 tiny discomforts that wore down the body and the spirit, day after relentless day. Consider the sounds, or lack thereof, the deep silence of a Greenland winter, broken only by the wind whistling through the cracks in your turf walls, or the distant howl of a wolf, if any still roamed. Inside, the crackle of a meager fire, the low murmur of voices, the bleating of a hungry sheep sharing your living space. Compare that to the cacophony of modern life, the constant hum of electricity, traffic, media. For the Greenland Norse, silence could be both a comfort and a terror, amplifying loneliness and the sounds of their own bodies struggling. A cough, a hungry stomach, the rasp of labored breathing. The world was quieter, but perhaps in its own way far more intense. And the smells. We've touched on the smoky interiors, the preserved food, but also the metallic tang of blood during a seal hunt, the salty spray of the ocean, the earthy scent of damp turf after a rare rain, the sharp, clean smell of glacial ice, perhaps the faint, sweet smell of wildflowers during the brief summer, a fleeting reminder of life's tenacity. Our modern world is often deodorized, sanitized. Their world was rich with smells, many of which we would find overpowering or unpleasant, but which were simply the olfactory landscape of their existence, signaling danger, sustenance, or the changing of the cruelly short season. The concept of leisure as we know it would be alien. Every waking hour for most would be consumed by tasks essential for survival, tending livestock, mending tools, preparing hides, foraging for fuel, childcare, food preparation, even storytelling or carving, while providing a cultural outlet, often served a purpose, preserving history, teaching skills, or creating necessary items. There was little room for idleness when the margin between survival and disaster was so thin. The romance of a simpler life quickly evaporates when you consider the sheer, unrelenting labor required just to see the next sunrise. What about their dreams and aspirations? Did they dream of returning to the lusher lands of Iceland or Norway? Did they hope for a better future for their children in Greenland? Or did their horizons shrink, over generations, to the confines of their fjord, their farm, their daily struggle? The sagas give us glimpses of proud, independent people, but the archaeological record whispers of a slow surrender. It's a poignant thought, the gradual erosion of hope, the fading of a cultural memory, as the world outside their icy refuge moved on without them, eventually forgetting they were even there. This journey into Viking Greenland isn't meant to diminish their incredible resilience, or their achievements in settling such a formidable land. Rather, it's to strip away the layers of myth and romanticism that often cling to historical figures, especially Viking. They were not caricatures of horned helmeted warriors, but ordinary people, men, women and children, facing extraordinary hardship. Their story is a powerful reminder that history in its unvarnished state is often far more complex and far more sobering than the popular tales we tell ourselves. It's a history of adaptation, yes, but also of limits, of environmental determinism, and ultimately, of a quiet, lonely end. Their settlements, now silent ruins, stand as monuments to a remarkable, if ultimately doomed chapter of human expansion. The wind whispers through the collapsed stone walls of Halsey Church, perhaps carrying faint echoes of the last Norse voices to sing hymns. The landscape, though still harsh, is slowly reclaiming what was once theirs. It's a starkly beautiful, melancholic place, imbued with the weight of their forgotten struggle. Visiting these sites, or even just contemplating their existence, forces a recalibration of our understanding of the Viking Age, less about glorious conquest, and more about the raw, gritty and often tragic business of survival on the very edge of the world. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll carry with you a different image of the Vikings in Greenland, not just the adventurers, but the farmers, the mothers, the children, huddled against the cold, their faces lit by the flickering glow of a seal oil lamp. Their story is a testament to human tenacity, but also a somber lesson in how even the most determined can be overwhelmed by forces beyond their control. It's a narrative that should make us appreciate the warmth of our beds, the food in our pantries, and the relative ease of our modern lives, built upon centuries of accumulated knowledge and comfort they could only dream of. So as the narrative of their struggle fades into the quiet of your room, let it be a reminder of the thin veneer of civilization, of the comforts we take for granted, and of the countless untold stories of hardship that underpin the grand sweep of history. The Greenland Vikings may have vanished, but their silent testament to the harsh realities of the past endures. May your own night be peaceful, and your dreams untroubled by the icy winds of the North Atlantic.
Across the shimmering expanse of the Sahel, where the Sahara's sands reluctantly surrendered to savanna, lay an empire of fabled wealth, its heart beating to the rhythm of gold. In the 14th century, while Europe grappled with famine, plague and incessant warfare, the Mali Empire flourished, a beacon of stability and astonishing prosperity in West Africa. Its fame, whispered along trans-Saharan trade routes, would eventually reach the ears of distant cartographers and kings, largely due to the reign of one man, Mansa Musa, a name that would become synonymous with unimaginable riches and profound piety. His story is not merely one of wealth, but of a transformative journey that placed his empire firmly on the medieval world map and cultivated a vibrant intellectual oasis in the heart of Africa. The Mali Empire had been forged from the remnants of the Ghana Empire generations earlier, its foundations laid by the legendary Sundiata Keita. By the time Musa ascended to the throne, likely around 1312, Mali controlled vast territories stretching from the Atlantic coast eastward into the Sahara, encompassing major trading cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Djenné. Its power and wealth stemmed from its control over prolific goldfields, Bambouk, Bira, and Galam, whose output was the envy of the known world. Salt, another precious commodity, was traded southward from Saharan mines like Tagaza, while kola nuts, slaves and manufactured goods flowed along the intricate network of caravan trails. Mansa Musa inherited not a fledgling state, but a sophisticated and well-administered empire. Details of Musa's early life and his precise path to becoming Mansa, meaning king or emperor in the Mandinka language, are somewhat obscured by the mists of time, reliant more on oral traditions and later Arab chronicles than contemporary Malian records. Some accounts suggest he was the grandnephew of Sundiata. Others claim his predecessor Mansa Abubakari II, a ruler consumed by a fascination with the limits of the Atlantic Ocean, embarked on a grand voyage with a fleet of ships, appointing Musa as regent and vanishing into the western horizon, never to return. Regardless of the specifics, Musa proved to be a capable and astute ruler. He consolidated Mali's control over its diverse peoples, promoted agriculture, and ensured the safety of the vital trade routes that were the lifeblood of his realm. But it was his deep Islamic faith that would define his most celebrated undertaking. As a devout Muslim, the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, was a religious obligation he felt compelled to fulfill. This was not to be a modest journey. For a ruler of Mansa Musa's stature and resources, it was an opportunity to display the glory of God, the strength of his empire, and his own personal piety on an international stage. Preparations for the Hajj, which commenced around 1324, were on a scale that beggared belief. It was a logistical feat of immense proportions, an entire city in motion. The caravan that eventually set forth from Niani, the capital of Mali, was a spectacle unlike any seen before. Chroniclers, though their figures vary, paint a picture of breathtaking extravagance. Tens of thousands of soldiers, civilians and slaves formed the core of the procession. Some accounts speak of 500 heralds, each bearing a staff of pure gold, marching ahead of Musa, who rode on horseback or, at times, was carried in a magnificent litter. An immense baggage train accompanied them, with camels, potentially numbering in the thousands, laden not only with provisions for the arduous journey across the Sahara, but also with astonishing quantities of gold dust and nuggets. Estimates of the gold he took vary wildly, but even the most conservative figures suggest a colossal fortune, intended for alms, gifts and the expenses of his retinue. The journey itself was an epic undertaking, traversing thousands of miles of harsh, unforgiving desert terrain. The organization required to move such a vast number of people and animals, to ensure they were fed and watered in one of the world's most arid regions, speaks volumes about the administrative capabilities of the Mali Empire. Along the way, Musa dispensed charity with a lavish hand. In every town and city they passed where there was a Friday mosque, he reportedly financed the construction of a new one. His passage was marked by acts of generosity that left local populations in awe. The most detailed accounts of Mansa Musa's Hajj come from his time in Cairo, then the capital of the powerful Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and a major cosmopolitan center. His arrival in July 1324 created an unprecedented sensation. The sheer size of his entourage and the opulence on display were staggering. The Mamluk Sultan, al-Nasir Muhammad, initially expected Musa to perform the customary act of prostration, kissing the ground before him. Musa, however, as a proud and powerful sovereign in his own right, was reluctant, stating he would only prostrate himself before God. After some diplomatic negotiation, a compromise was reached, but the incident highlighted Musa's own sense of royal dignity. During his 3-month stay in Cairo, Mansa Musa's generosity became legendary. He bestowed vast quantities of gold upon courtiers, officials, religious scholars and the poor. He gave so much gold, in fact, that he inadvertently flooded the carrying market, causing the value of gold to plummet. According to the historian Al-Umari, who visited Cairo a dozen years later, gold was still devalued due to Musa's visit. It took more than a decade for the market to recover. This unintentional economic disruption, while perhaps inconvenient for carrying merchants at the time, became a powerful testament to the almost mythical wealth of Mali, broadcast throughout the Middle East and eventually into Europe. Musa did not just spend gold, he also borrowed, reportedly taking out loans at high interest from carrying merchants, to finance the remainder of his pilgrimage or his return journey, perhaps having underestimated the full cost of his massive undertaking, or having been overly generous. This detail, often overlooked, adds a touch of human realism to the otherwise fantastical accounts of his wealth. From Cairo, Mansa Musa and his caravan proceeded to Mecca and Medina, the holy cities of Islam. There, he performed the sacred rites of the Hajj, with devotion, distributing further alms and deepening his engagement with the wider Islamic world. He encountered scholars, jurists, and architects from across the Muslim lands, an experience that profoundly influenced his vision for his own empire. He was not merely a tourist, he was a ruler absorbing new ideas, forging connections, and seeking knowledge to take back to his people. The return journey from Mecca was as significant as the outward one, for Mansa Musa did not return empty-handed in an intellectual or cultural sense. He was determined to bring the advancements and learning of the Islamic heartlands to West Africa. He persuaded numerous scholars, artists, and most notably architects to accompany him back to Mali. Among them was Abu Ishaq Ibrahim al-Sahili, an Andalusian poet, an architect from Granada, whom Musa commissioned to undertake ambitious building projects. Upon his return to Mali, likely in 1325 or 1326, Mansa Musa embarked on a program of cultural and religious construction that would transform key cities in his empire. Al-Sahili is credited with designing several important structures, most famously the Jengur Berber Mosque in Timbuktu. Using baked brick, a novel material in a region accustomed to Banco, adobe, he created a distinctive Sudano-Sahelian architectural style characterized by its imposing earthen structures, timber beam supports and elegant minarets. The Great Mosque of Djenné, though rebuilt several times, is another iconic example of this architectural tradition that Musa helped to foster. Timbuktu, already an established center of the trans-Saharan salt and gold trade, blossomed under Mansa Musa's patronage into a renowned center of Islamic scholarship and learning. He established mosques that doubled as madrasas, Islamic schools, attracting scholars and students from across Africa and the Middle East. Libraries were built, and the book trade flourished. Subjects taught included theology, Islamic law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine and literature. Timbuktu became a city of scholars, its intellectual vibrancy rivaling that of other great Islamic centers of learning. The Sankore Mosque, later developed into the Sankore University, became particularly famous, housing thousands of manuscripts. Gao, another major city in the empire, also benefited from Musa's patronage, with new mosques and public buildings. These architectural and educational endeavors were not merely for show, they were part of a deliberate effort to deepen Islamic practice, promote literacy, and enhance the administrative capabilities of the empire. By investing in education and creating an environment conducive to scholarship, Mansa Musa laid the groundwork for a golden age of learning in West Africa. Mansa Musa's Hajj had another profound if indirect consequence.
It firmly placed Mali on the consciousness of the wider world, particularly Europe. Tales of the fabulously wealthy African king, who spent gold so freely spread far and wide. European cartographers began to depict Mali and its ruler on their maps. The most famous example is the Catalan Atlas of 1370. It shows a crowned Mansa Musa seated on a throne in the heart of West Africa, holding a golden orb or nugget, a clear representation of his immense wealth and power. This image challenged prevailing European notions of Africa as a continent solely of primitive peoples, introducing the concept of sophisticated and wealthy kingdoms in its interior. The remainder of Mansa Musa's reign, until his death around 1337, was largely peaceful and prosperous. He continued to foster trade, promote Islam, and administer his vast empire effectively. He sent diplomatic missions to Morocco and other states, further integrating Mali into the wider Islamic political and economic sphere. His reign is often considered the zenith of the Mali Empire's power and prestige. He created a legacy not just of wealth, but of cultural efflorescence, intellectual advancement, and international recognition. After his death, the Mali Empire continued to be a significant power for some time, ruled by his son Mukdan I, and later his brother Mansa Suleiman, who also maintained the empire's prosperity and Islamic character. However, internal succession disputes in the rise of rival states, notably the Songhai Empire centered on Gao, gradually led to Mali's decline over the following centuries. Yet the memory of Mansa Musa's golden age endured. The story of Mansa Musa serves as a vital corrective to Eurocentric historical narratives that have often marginalized or ignored the achievements of African civilization. He was a contemporary of European monarchs like Edward III of England and Philip VI of France, yet his empire rivaled if not surpassed many European kingdoms of the era in terms of wealth, size and organization. His Hajj was not merely an act of personal piety, it was a geopolitical event that impacted economies, facilitated cultural exchange, and reshaped perceptions of Africa. His legacy is multifaceted. Economically, his lavish spending in Cairo, while disruptive, advertised the immense gold reserves of West Africa, stimulating further trade, and arguably, fueling European interest in accessing these resources directly, which would later contribute to the age of exploration. Culturally, his patronage transformed cities like Timbuktu into legendary centers of learning, preserving and advancing Islamic scholarship for generations. Architecturally, he inspired a unique style that continues to define the Sahelian landscape. Mansa Musa was more than just the richest man who ever lived, a title often sensationally attributed to him, though his wealth was undoubtedly staggering. He was a visionary leader, a nation builder, and a patron of the arts and science. He understood the power of faith, diplomacy and knowledge. He used his immense resources not just for personal aggrandizement, but to elevate his people, his religion and his empire on the world stage. His journey across the Sahara was a testament to human ambition and organizational skill, a golden thread woven into the rich tapestry of African history. While empires rise and fall, and fortunes can be ephemeral, the intellectual and cultural currents, set in motion by figures like Mansa Musa, often have a more lasting impact. The libraries of Timbuktu, though many of their precious manuscripts have been lost or dispersed over time due to conflict and neglect, still whisper of an age when West Africa was a vibrant hub of global learning, a legacy that owes much to the vision of its golden king. His reign reminds us that history is a vast, interconnected ocean, and that great civilizations have flourished in all corners of the globe, each contributing its unique voice to the human story. The sands of the Sahara may shift, but the legend of Mansa Musa, the Lion of Mali, endures.
The Bay of Naples, a serene crescent of azure water under the warm Italian sun, had long been a favored retreat for Rome's elite. Along its picturesque coastline, towns like Pompeii and Herculaneum thrived, bustling with commerce, adorned with lavish villas, and echoing with the vibrant rhythms of Roman life. Their citizens lived with a comforting sense of permanence, their days filled with the familiar routines of work, leisure and worship. Towering benignly over this idyllic landscape was Mount Vesuvius, a verdant giant that had slumbered for centuries, its fertile slopes cultivated with vineyards and orchards, giving little hint of the cataclysmic power brewing within its depths. But in the late summer of 79 AD, this deceptive tranquility was about to be shattered in one of history's most infamous natural disasters. Pompeii was a prosperous commercial hub. Its streets, paved with large stone slabs, were lined with shops, taverns, bakeries and workshops. The Forum, the heart of civic life, buzzed with activity, surrounded by temples, administrative buildings and markets. Wealthy Romans built opulent villas adorned with intricate mosaics and vibrant frescoes, depicting mythological scenes, idyllic landscapes, and everyday activities. Public baths offered places for socializing and relaxation, while amphitheaters hosted gladiatorial contests and other spectacles for the entertainment of the populace. Life in Pompeii was a microcosm of the Roman Empire at its height, organized, sophisticated and seemingly secure. Herculaneum, a smaller, wealthier coastal town, was perhaps even more luxurious, favored by affluent Romans for its seaside location and refined atmosphere. Its villas were even more grand, its public buildings exquisitely decorated. Unlike Pompeii, which was more of a working town, Herculaneum had the air of an exclusive resort. Its inhabitants, like those in Pompeii, went about their lives largely unaware of the geological fault lines that ran deep beneath their feet. There had been tremors before, most notably a severe earthquake in 62 AD, that caused significant damage, but memories faded, buildings were repaired or rebuilt, and life resumed its course. Vesuvius remained a silent, green guardian. The morning of August 24, 79 AD, began like any other. The markets opened, craftsmen set to work, and children played in the streets. Then, around midday, the mountain began to stir. A series of small explosions, perhaps dismissed by some as minor earth tremors, heralded the awakening. Soon after, a colossal column of ash, pumice, and superheated gas erupted from the volcano's crater, soaring miles into the sky, forming a terrifying umbrella pine-shaped cloud that blotted out the sun. Pliny the Younger, a Roman author and administrator who witnessed the eruption from Misenum, across the bay, later described this ominous cloud in a letter to the historian Tacitus, providing one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of the event. For the people of Pompeii, located about 5 miles southeast of the crater, the initial phase of the eruption brought a terrifying rain of pumice stones and ash. The sky turned black, and the air grew thick with suffocating dust. The sheer weight of the falling debris began to cause roofs to collapse, trapping those who had sought shelter indoors. Panic set in. Some tried to flee, clutching their valuables, heading towards the city gates or the coast. Others, perhaps believing the worst would soon pass, or unable to escape, remained in their homes. The relentless fall of pumice continued for hours, steadily burying the city under a thick blanket of volcanic material. Herculaneum, situated closer to the volcano but to its west, initially experienced a different, though no less terrifying sequence of events. Prevailing winds carried the main ash plume away from it, towards Pompeii and Stabia. For a few hours, Herculaneum seemed to be spared the worst of the direct fallout. Many of its inhabitants, seeing the unfolding horror across the bay, likely made their way to the beach, hoping to escape by sea. Here, huddled in stone boathouses or along the shoreline, they awaited rescue, a rescue that would never come. As night fell on that fateful day, the nature of the eruption shifted. The massive eruptive column, no longer able to support its own weight, began to collapse, unleashing a series of devastating pyroclastic surges and flows, superheated, fast-moving avalanches of gas, ash and rock fragments. These fiery torrents, reaching temperatures of hundreds of degrees Celsius and traveling at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, were a far more lethal force than the falling pumice. The first major pyroclastic surge to hit Herculaneum arrived in the early hours of August. It swept down the slopes of Vesuvius with incredible speed, engulfing the town in an instant. Those sheltering in the boathouses by the sea were killed almost instantaneously by the intense heat, their bodies flash-heated to such a degree that their soft tissues vaporized, leaving behind only skeleton. The town was then rapidly buried under successive layers of hot volcanic material, which solidified into a dense, rock-like tuff, preserving buildings, organic materials like wood and textiles, and even foodstuffs, to an extraordinary degree. Pompeii's fate was sealed by later pyroclastic flows. After hours of enduring the pumice fall, which had already buried the city several feet deep, these superheated surges swept through the remaining structures, and over the landscape. Anyone still alive, whether caught in the streets or trapped in buildings, would have perished instantly from the thermal shock or asphyxiation. The flows deposited thick layers of fine ash, that conformed to the shapes of everything they covered, including the bodies of the. As the bodies decayed over time, they left behind hollow cavities in the compacted ash, silent imprints of their final moments. Other towns in the vicinity, such as Stabia and Oplontis, also suffered immense devastation. Pliny the Elder, the uncle of Pliny the Younger, renowned naturalist and commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum, sailed across the bay, in an attempt to investigate the phenomenon, and rescue those in peril. He landed at Stabia but was overcome by toxic gases and died, a victim of his own scientific curiosity and courage. His nephew's detailed letters, written years later to preserve the memory of his uncle's heroic death, and to describe the eruption's terrifying progress, provide an invaluable, chillingly vivid account of the disaster. In the aftermath, the once vibrant landscape around Vesuvius was transformed into a desolate, gray wasteland. Pompeii, Herculaneum, and other settlements lay buried,
their names and exact locations slowly fading from memory. Some attempts at salvage may have been made in the immediate aftermath, but the sheer scale of the burial made full recovery impossible, with Roman-era technology. Over centuries, new soil formed over the volcanic deposits, vegetation returned, and new settlements were built atop the forgotten cities. Vesuvius itself, its profile altered by the eruption, eventually returned to a state of quiescence, though it would erupt many times again in subsequent centuries, never with such devastating consequences for such populous areas. For nearly 1700 years, Pompeii and Herculaneum remained largely undisturbed, their secrets locked beneath layers of volcanic debris. While vague memories of lost cities persisted in local folklore, their precise locations were unknown. It was not until the 18th century that they began to be rediscovered, quite by accident. The initial discoveries at Herculaneum occurred in 1709 during the digging of a well, leading to sporadic, treasure-hunting excavations under Bourbon patronage. Pompeii was rediscovered later, in 1748, also through chance finds during construction work. The early excavations were often haphazard, more concerned with recovering valuable artifacts and artworks for private collections or royal museums than with systematic archaeological investigation. Tunnels were dug into the hard and tough at Herculaneum, and trenches were cut through the softer pumice and ash layers at Pompeii. Yet even these rudimentary efforts began to reveal the astonishing state of preservation. It was in the mid-19th century, particularly under the direction of Giuseppe Fiorelli at Pompeii, from 1863, that archaeological methods became more scientific and systematic. Fiorelli introduced a meticulous approach to excavation, dividing the city into regions and insulae, blocks, and carefully documenting finds. His most ingenious and poignant innovation was the development of a technique to create plaster casts of the victim. By pouring liquid plaster into the voids left by the decayed bodies in the ash, archaeologists were able to produce remarkably detailed casts, capturing the final postures of men, women, children, and even animals at the moment of their death. These casts are haunting reminders of the human tragedy, offering a powerful, tangible connection to the past. The excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum have provided an unparalleled window into Roman life in the 1st century. Because the towns were buried so suddenly and completely, they offer a snapshot frozen in time, unlike sites that were gradually abandoned or continuously inhabited and altered. Streets, houses, shops, temples, theaters, and brothels have been unearthed, often with their contents remarkably intact. Frescoes retain their vibrant colors, mosaics their intricate patterns. Everyday objects, pottery, glassware, tools, furniture, jewelry, and even carbonized loaves of bread, still in ovens, have been found in situ, offering intimate glimpses into the daily routines, social structures, and material culture of the Roman world. At Herculaneum, the denser volcanic material and the nature of its burial led to the exceptional preservation of organic materials, including wooden beams, doors, screens, furniture, and even papyrus scrolls from a magnificent villa, known as the Villa of the These scrolls, though carbonized and extremely fragile, represent a unique library from antiquity, and ongoing efforts using advanced imaging technologies are slowly deciphering their contents, offering new insights into Epicurean philosophy and other texts. The discovery of over 300 skeletons in the boathouses at Herculaneum in the 1980s provided invaluable osteological data, allowing scientists to study the health, diet, and physical characteristics of the population. The study of Pompeii and Herculaneum is a continuous process. New discoveries are still being made, and new technologies are constantly refining our understanding of these ancient cities and the cataclysm that befell them. Graffiti scribbled on walls, election posters, shop signs, and personal letters offer insights into the language, concerns, and social dynamics of the inhabitants. The layout of the towns, their water supply systems, their sanitation facilities, and their defensive structures all speak to the sophisticated engineering and urban planning of the Roman. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD was an immense human tragedy, wiping out entire communities in a matter of hours. Yet paradoxically, this very destruction led to their extraordinary preservation, creating an archaeological treasure trove of incalculable value. These buried cities are not merely ruins, they are silent witnesses to a vibrant civilization, offering a direct and deeply personal connection to the people who lived and died there, nearly 2 millennia ago. Visiting Pompeii and Herculaneum today is a profound and moving experience. Walking along their ancient streets, stepping into houses, still adorned with the art and artifacts of their former occupants, one can almost hear the echoes of their lives, abruptly silenced by the fury of the volcano. It is a stark reminder of the awesome power of nature and the fragility of human existence, but it is also a testament to the resilience of human curiosity and the enduring quest to understand our past. The ashes of Vesuvius, which once brought death and oblivion, have in a strange twist of fate also granted a form of immortality to the lost cities of the Bay, allowing their stories to continue to unfold, captivating and educating generations. The silent sleeping giant of Vesuvius still watches over them, a constant reminder of that terrible day when time stood still.
The Nile, a timeless serpent of turquoise and gold, coiled through the deserts of Egypt, a land steeped in millennia of pharaonic grandeur and divine mystique. But as the first century before the Common Era dawned, this ancient kingdom, though still shimmering with the echoes of its past glories, found itself increasingly ensnared in the burgeoning power of Rome. It was into this world of fading Ptolemaic authority and looming Roman dominance that Cleopatra, the seventh of her name, was born, destined to become the last true pharaoh of Egypt, and a figure Ushabak in legend for eternity. Her early life in Alexandria, the glittering jewel of the Mediterranean, founded by Alexander the Great, was a crucible of intrigue and education. The Ptolemaic court was a viper's nest of familial ambition, where sibling rivalries often escalated into deadly power struggles. Cleopatra, however, was not merely a pawn in these dynastic games. She was possessed of a keen intellect, a voracious appetite for knowledge, and a charisma that would later captivate some of the most powerful men in the world. Fluent in multiple languages, including Egyptian, a rare feat among her Macedonian Greek ancestors who had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, she understood the profound connection between ruler and ruled, and the power of shared identity. The kingdom she was to inherit was fractured. Her father Ptolemy XII Auletes was a weak and unpopular ruler, derisively nicknamed the flute player, for his artistic pretensions rather than his statesmanship. His reign was propped up by Roman loans and political maneuvering, a precarious dependency that cast a long shadow over Egypt's sovereignty. Upon his death, the throne passed to Cleopatra, then a young woman of 18, and her even younger brother Ptolemy XVIII, to whom she was married according to Ptolemaic custom. This co-rule was inherently unstable, a tinderbox awaiting a spark. The spark soon came. The courtiers surrounding her young brother, notably the eunuch Pothinus, saw in Cleopatra a threat to their own influence. They conspired against her, fanning the flames of discord, and eventually drove her from Alexandria. Undeterred, Cleopatra retreated to Syria, where she began to gather an army, her determination to reclaim her birthright unyielding. She was not merely a dispossessed princess. She was a queen preparing for war, a strategist, assessing her options in a world dominated by ruthless men. It was during this period of exile that the Roman civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great spilled onto Egyptian shores. After his defeat at Pharsalus, Pompey sought refuge in Egypt, hoping to leverage his past alliances with the Ptolemaic dynasty. Instead, the advisors to the young Ptolemy XVIII, in a disastrous miscalculation, aimed at currying favor with the victorious Caesar, had Pompey assassinated as he stepped ashore. This act, intended to please Caesar, instead horrified him. Roman senators, even enemies, were not to be butchered so ignominiously. Caesar arrived in Alexandria shortly thereafter, not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror demanding answers, and the settlement of Ptolemy Auletes' massive debts to Rome. He found a city in turmoil, with Cleopatra's forces camped outside and her brother's faction controlling the palace. It was in this charged atmosphere that Cleopatra orchestrated one of history's most audacious entrants. Knowing she could not openly approach the palace, legend tells us she had herself smuggled past enemy lines, wrapped in a carpet or a bed sack, and delivered directly to Caesar's private chambers. The image is potent. The young queen, emerging from humble wrappings, not as a beggar but as a bold petitioner, ready to state her case. Caesar, then in his early 50s, a seasoned general and statesman, was reportedly charmed and impressed by her audacity, her intelligence, and her articulate defense of her claim to the throne. He saw in her not just a beautiful woman, but a potentially valuable ally, a ruler who could stabilize Egypt and ensure its resources, particularly its vital grain supply, flowed reliably to Rome. What followed was the Alexandrian War, a tense and often brutal conflict, fought within the city itself. Caesar, with his relatively small Roman contingent, found himself besieged in the royal palace by the forces loyal to Ptolemy. Cleopatra stood by Caesar, her knowledge of the city and her local support proving invaluable. The famous Library of Alexandria, a beacon of ancient learning, suffered damage during the fighting,
a tragic casualty of the conflict. Eventually Roman reinforcements arrived. Ptolemy XVIII was defeated and drowned in the Nile, and Caesar reinstated Cleopatra as queen, this time alongside another younger brother, Ptolemy XVIII, whom she also married. But her true partner, in power and in affection, was Caesar. Their liaison was both political and personal. For Caesar, Cleopatra represented a secure and wealthy Egypt, a vital asset in his vast and ever-expanding Roman world. For Cleopatra, Caesar was the guarantor of her throne, and the protector of her kingdom's fragile autonomy. Their union produced a son, Ptolemy Caesar, nicknamed Caesarion, Little Caesar, whom Cleopatra proudly presented as Caesar's child and heir, a claim that resonated with significance in both Egypt and Rome. She even journeyed to Rome, residing in Caesar's villa, across the Tiber, a move that scandalized the conservative Roman elite, who viewed her as an exotic and dangerously influential foreign queen. Her time in Rome was a display of regal splendor, but also a period of careful observation. She witnessed firsthand the complexities of Roman politics, the simmering resentments against Caesar's growing power, and the deeply ingrained Roman suspicion of monarchy. When Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's world was once again thrown into turmoil. Her protector was gone, and Rome descended into another round of civil war. With Caesarion's legitimacy now a dangerous political issue in Rome, she prudently returned to Egypt. In the power vacuum left by Caesar's death, new strongmen emerged: Caesar's adopted son Octavian, and his loyal general Mark Antony. Initially, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, dividing the Roman world amongst themselves. Antony took control of the eastern provinces, which inevitably brought him into Cleopatra's orbit. Their first significant meeting took place in Tarsus, in modern-day Turkey. Antony, needing Egyptian resources for his planned campaign against Parthia, summoned Cleopatra to answer charges that she had aided his enemies. Cleopatra, ever the astute politician and master of spectacle, turned the summons into a triumph. She arrived not as a contrite vassal, but as the goddess Aphrodite, sailing up the Cydnus River on a magnificent barge with silver oars, purple sails, and an entourage dressed as Nereids and Graces, all to the sound of flutes and lyre. Perfumes wafted from the barge to the riverbanks, where crowds gathered to witness the spectacle. Antony, a man known for his appreciation of both power and pleasure, was captivated. He had known Cleopatra briefly during his earlier military service in Egypt, but this was a different encounter. This was a meeting of equals, or at least, of a queen determined to be treated as such. Their Tarsus meeting marked the beginning of a legendary love affair, and a powerful political alliance that would last for over a decade and shake the foundations of the Roman world. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria with Antony in tow. For several years they lived a life of opulence and shared governance. Antony, though Roman, seemed to embrace the Hellenistic culture of Alexandria. They formed a society known as the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to feasting, revelry, and intellectual pursuits. But beneath the surface of this hedonistic lifestyle, serious political calculations were at play. Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later Ptolemy Philadelphus. These children were not merely tokens of affection, they were integral to Cleopatra's vision of a revitalized Eastern Empire, with Alexandria as its capital, and her dynasty at its heart. The donations of Alexandria, in 34 BCE, was a particularly bold, and ultimately fatal move. In a lavish public ceremony, Antony declared Caesarion to be Caesar's true son and heir, and thus King of Kings, with Cleopatra as Queen of Kings. He then distributed vast territories in the east, some already Roman, some yet to be conquered, to Cleopatra and their children. To the Romans, particularly Octavian, this was an outrageous affront. It seemed Antony had gone native, abandoning Roman traditions and interests for an Eastern queen, bestowing Roman lands upon foreign rulers, and challenging Octavian's own position as Caesar's primary heir. Octavian, a master propagandist, seized upon the donations and Antony's relationship with Cleopatra, to paint Antony as a man bewitched by a foreign sorceress, a traitor to Rome who sought to establish an Eastern monarchy that would supplant Roman authority. He skillfully fanned the flames of xenophobia and moral outrage in Rome, portraying Cleopatra as a decadent, power-hungry seductress, who aimed to rule Rome itself from Alexandria. The narrative was effective. Roman sentiment turned decisively against Antony and Cleopatra. The final confrontation was inevitable. Octavian maneuvered the Senate into declaring war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, a clever tactic that allowed him to frame the conflict as a foreign war, rather than another Roman civil war, though in essence it was both. The decisive battle took place at Actium, on the western coast of Greece, in 31 BC. It was primarily a naval engagement. The details of the battle are contested, colored by Octavian's later propaganda, but the outcome was clear. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was defeated. According to some accounts, Cleopatra, perhaps fearing capture or sensing the battle was lost, withdrew her squadron of ships prematurely, and Antony, seeing her leave, followed her, abandoning his forces. Whatever the precise sequence of events, Actium was a disaster. Antony's land forces, deserted by their commander, eventually surrendered. The couple fled back to Alexandria, their dreams of an Eastern empire shattered, their remaining forces dwindling. Octavian pursued them relentlessly, his victory all but assured. As Octavian's legions closed in on Alexandria in 30 BCE, Antony, receiving a false report of Cleopatra's death, fell on his sword. Mortally wounded, he was carried to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she had barricaded herself with her closest attendants, and died in her arms. It was a tragic end to a partnership that had once seemed poised to reshape the world. Cleopatra's own end is shrouded in drama and uncertainty, though the most enduring story, largely propagated by Roman sources, is that she committed suicide by allowing an asp, a venomous Egyptian cobra, to bite her. She had reportedly experimented with various poisons, seeking a death that was swift and painless, wishing to avoid the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph. By choosing the asp, a symbol of divine royalty in Egypt, she may have sought to control her own narrative even in death, dying as a queen, not a captive. Octavian, upon entering Alexandria, is said to have wished to capture Cleopatra alive. Her death, while politically convenient in removing a potent symbol of resistance, robbed him of the ultimate prize for his triumphal procession. He did, however, execute Caesar Ion, ruthlessly eliminating any potential rival claimant to Caesar's legacy, reportedly uttering the chilling phrase, "Too many Caesar." Antony and Cleopatra's other children were spared and taken to Rome, where they were raised by Octavia, Antony's dutiful Roman wife whom he had abandoned for Cleopatra. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, came to an end. Egypt became a Roman province, its immense wealth and grain supplies now directly under Roman control, personally overseen by Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Hellenistic Age, that vibrant period of Greek cultural influence that had blossomed after Alexander the Great's conquests, effectively concluded with her demise. Cleopatra's legacy is complex and enduring. For centuries she has been portrayed variously as a femme fatale, a brilliant political strategist, a devoted patriot, or a tragic romantic heroine. Roman historians, writing from the perspective of the victors, often emphasized her seductive powers and her perceived threat to Roman virtue and stability. Later artists, playwrights and poets, from Shakespeare to Hollywood filmmakers, have been captivated by her story, often focusing on her romances with Caesar and Antony. Yet beyond the romanticized and often vilified portrayals, lies a more nuanced reality. Cleopatra was a highly educated, multilingual ruler, who actively sought to restore Egypt's power and prestige in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. She understood the intricacies of international politics, the importance of economic strength, and the power of image and propaganda. She navigated a treacherous political landscape with courage and intelligence, using all the tools at her disposal, her intellect, her charm, her wealth and her royal lineage, to protect her kingdom and her dynasty. She was a product of her time, a Hellenistic monarch who also embraced Egyptian traditions when it suited her political aims. She presented herself to her Egyptian subjects as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, a powerful maternal deity, thereby strengthening her legitimacy and popular support. Her efforts to manage the Egyptian economy, to ensure the welfare of her people, and to maintain Egypt's cultural identity in the face of Roman expansion speak to her capabilities as a ruler. The story of Cleopatra is more than just a tale of love and betrayal. It is a story of ambition, power and the clash of civilizations. It is the story of the last queen of an ancient kingdom, fighting to preserve its independence against the inexorable rise of an empire. She ultimately failed in her grandest ambitions, but her defiance, her intellect and her indomitable spirit ensured that she would not be forgotten. Even in defeat, Cleopatra managed to captivate the imagination of the world, her name echoing through the corridors of history, as a symbol of a fascinating and tumultuous era, a queen who dared to challenge Rome, and for a fleeting moment, held the fate of empires in her hand. The Nile continues its timeless journey, bearing witness to her legend, a legend as enduring as the sands of Egypt themselves. Word count, 5.